Hi everyone, Mike here from Heroes and Bosses, and this time I'll be building a large, grimdark base for Warhammer 40k. This is a 105 by 70 millimeter base, and I'm first using it to trace 3 ovals onto a piece of cork board. This base is going to be fairly thick, hence the multiple sections of cork. After tracing it out, I'm cutting these roughly to shape and then breaking off the edges. On the first piece of corkboard, I'm breaking out a little indent so I can make a pool. I want to have a sewage or water pipe leading to the pool, so for that I'm using a biodegradable straw. These are made of thick paper and treated to be water resistant, so I figured it wouldn't warp once there was paint on it. For the next piece of cork, I want it to fit roughly on top of the first piece, but it'll be a little bit smaller. I don't want the next piece to have any overhang. I'd rather create a slope or a flat side that I can embed things into. This is also the piece that's going to have the pipe in it, so after breaking it so it fits the shape of the pool, I'm tracing a spot for the straw to fit into and then cutting it with my hobby knife. And now I'm just breaking up that third piece so that it fits roughly on top of the previous two. Once I figure out where I want this first piece of cork to fit, I'm tracing around it with a pencil. I want to make sure it goes right back to that spot, and I'm using Gorilla Glue so I won't have a lot of time to adjust it once it's on there. A little safety tip when working with Gorilla Glue, avoid getting it in your hair at all costs or you could end up becoming famous. So there's a small problem. The pipe is slightly wider than the cork, so the next piece of cork won't sit flat on top. One way to fix this would be to dig out a groove for the pipe to fit into and then use texture paste to hide any gaps. I wanted to have some toothpicks embedded between the top 2 layers anyhow, so I'm going to put these layers together in a different way. I'm going to go ahead and glue the first 2 layers together, and then I'm cutting out a piece of window screen that's going to be poking out one side of the cork. I want it to look like this was once a slab of reinforced concrete. Once I have a decent size cut, I'm going to rough up the edges a bit with a pair of scissors. The screen looks good, so I'm gluing that to the cork and tamping it down with another small piece of cork. Next, I'm going to use some large toothpicks for the rebar on this reinforced concrete, though it can be any long, thin material. I often use paper clips for my rebar. I'm laying out all the pieces before I glue them, and I'm also cutting some extra pieces to make a framework on top of the cork so that the piece on top stays nice and level. Now that I've figured out where I want all these pieces to go, I'm going to glue them in place, and I'm also going to glue down the straw sewer pipe. Next I'll be using some texture paste to seal these pieces together and to blend them together so they look like one continuous piece of terrain instead of 3 slabs of corkboard. All the bare patches of the plastic are getting covered first, and then I'm putting this texture paste all around the outside rim of the middle piece of corkboard. This is going to hide this large gap while also acting as a glue to hold these pieces together. Before I squish the lid onto this like a giant ice cream sandwich, I'm adding some super glue to the toothpicks that are on the inside. After that, I'm leaving this alone for a couple of hours to dry. The texture paste I'm using here is Vallejo's Desert Sand, but you could certainly use others. I'm now adding this all around the gap and in random thick patches all around the edges of the cork. As I said before, the goal is to try to make it look like one thick piece of rock and earth. Along the sides, I'm going to be sticking in some skulls to make them look like they were buried here a long time ago. I'm also sticking in some debris, just some random bits left over from various Warhammer 40k models. I'm also putting a small screw into this paste. On this scale, it might look like it belonged to a large machine of some kind. And before this texture paste dries, I'm adding a few sprinkles of sand to random places, just to get some variety of texture. Here's how the base is shaping up so far, and as you can see, the top is pretty bland looking, so I'm going to focus on that next. I want to add a little bit of debris to the top, but nothing that's going to hinder attaching a miniature too much. I'm going to try to make a metal panel that looks like it's been blasted off of a vehicle. I'm first cutting a rectangle out of plasticard. If you don't have any of this, you can use old gift cards. Some have raised numbers that you can somehow use as well. So after cutting a section of this out, I'm going to bang it up a bit. I'm using the end of a paintbrush to jam some dents from bullets or shrapnel, and I'm bending up a couple of the corners. I also want this to look like it was bolted over something before it was ripped off, so I'm drilling small holes into each of the four corners. The top of the base is a little too smooth, so I'm going to use the end of a sculpting tool to chip up a few potholes on the surface. There's just one last touch to the top of the base I want to do. After I glue on the sheet of scrap metal, I'm mixing up a bit of PVA and water. I'm going to use this to add a few patches of sand and gravel. One thing all texture pastes have in common is that they shrink when they dry. I typically add one thick layer starting out, and then I'll do a few touch-ups with more texture paste later. I'm calling this done for now, and I'm letting everything dry and harden before spraying the whole thing with a black primer. Now I'm going to start the painting process. I'm starting off by covering the entire base with 3 different colors. All of the mud, rock, and skulls are getting covered with watered-down Mournfang Brown. I'm leaving the top third or so of the base unpainted, however, because I want that to look like an exposed piece of wall. The brush I'm using for all of this is a makeup brush from the dollar store, good for dry brushing and big, messy paint jobs. Next, I'm rinsing off the brush and switching to some watered-down Mechanicus Standard Gray. I'm completely covering the top of the base with this and along the edge. The Mournfang Brown is still wet at this point, and when I get down that far with the brush, I'm dabbing the Mechanicus Standard Gray into it and wet blending these colors where they meet. Occasionally I'm going back to the Mournfang Brown, getting that on my brush, and I'm mashing that along the edge too. You don't want a perfect line of brown meeting gray. I want it to look like the wall is mostly covered up in dirt, and wind and weather have exposed it. The third color I'm using for the base coat is Rough Iron from Army Painter, which actually looks like a deep bronze. This is getting used on the sticks in the window screen, the sewer pipe, the sheet of scrap metal, and all the little bits of junk sticking out of the mud. Next I'm using a wash I call Machinery Wash. It's a mix of 3 parts Nuln Oil, 2 parts Agrax Earthshade, and 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm putting this on all of the areas that were just painted with the rough iron. I'm also putting this over all of the skulls, the patches of rock and gravel that are on top of the base, and in some random patches of dirt scattered around the edge of the base. Next I'm going to do 2 layers of dry brushing over the dirt and skulls. The The first is going to be with Steel Legion Drab. I'm dry brushing all of the muddy areas with this pretty heavily, and I'm also creeping up the edges of the gray wall as well. This will help blend the brown and gray areas together a little bit more. Now I'm switching to Xandri Dust, and this time I'll only be using downward brush strokes. I just want to pick out the most raised areas with this and create a more dusty looking dirt. I am using this a bit more heavily on the skulls, however. I want those to be a bit brighter than the dirt. I'm also going to do a bit of dry brushing on the road, but only after the Xandri Dust is mostly off my brush. This is just to give the road a more dusty appearance. I want to be sparing with this though, I just want a bit of color here and there. Next I switched to Dawnstone, and I did a little more dry brushing on the surface of the road and some of the rocks and sand up there. The final dry brush I'm doing is only on the skulls. I'm using a slightly lighter color than Xandri Dust and making gentle downward strokes with the dry brush. I'm mostly just picking out the facial features on each of the skulls. For the next part, I want to do one more thing to the sheet of scrap metal. I'm going to add some numbers to it using water transfers. I've already made a video on how to do this, so I'm just going to speed through this part. First thing I do is just cover the entire surface with a gloss varnish. Next I'll soak the transfers in a bit of water. Next I'll get the area wet where I want to add the transfers, and then I'll put the transfers in place. I'm patting those down gently with a bit of paper towel, and then I'm covering the entire surface with another layer of gloss varnish to seal in the transfers. Then once that's dry, I'm going to put on a layer of matte medium or matte varnish so I can continue painting over that spot. Now I want to age these numbers a bit, so I'm stippling on some of the original rough iron and I'm putting some chips onto the numbers. Then I'm going to add another layer or two of the machine wash to fade out these numbers a bit. I'm mixing all three of these colors with a lot of water because I want them to pool. Any place that water might settle is where I want the heaviest rust. I always start with my darkest rust color and I dab this all over the metal areas that I want to look rusty. I might also add another layer here and there to increase the color intensity. I feel like this metal panel is still a bit too smooth looking, so I'm dabbing a few random spots of typhus corrosion on it. Now I'm switching to the next lightest rust color. If you don't have a rusty orange, just mixing a bit of dark brown or Mournfang brown into a bright orange will give you this color. This color is going over the same rusty areas, but covering a smaller area. You never want to completely cover the other colors. Something rusty is going to likely have several shades of oranges and browns on it. The last color, the yellow-orange, is only going into areas that I want to look heavily rusted or pitted. The next part is optional. You can achieve a similar look with just paint and stippling, but I'm going to be using two rust-colored pigment powders that look similar to the mud and rust I've already used. I'm getting a bit onto a large makeup brush and pushing it into the bristles using some paper towel. Now, despite these being rust pigments, I'm mostly using it on the dirt to make it blend in better with the road. I'm also using it sparingly on the metal areas too, but I don't want to cover over or ruin the rust colors I've already applied to those. So just like with the paint, I'm adding the darker color first. It's easy to overdo it with the pigment powders. I'm just taking my time and only using small amounts on my brush. Now a small tip with the pigment powders. You can seal them down with a matte varnish, but when you do, they liquefy and then dry looking just like normal paint. What you can do is seal your base first with a matte varnish and then add these as a last step. The pigment powder sticks to coarse surfaces really well, so if you're adding it to sand or cork, it's not coming off. If you want to keep that dusty look, don't spray it with a varnish. Just make sure you mash it in really well with your brush. And like I said, only on coarse surfaces. The final step is to paint the rim with the color of your choice. And there you have it, another Wasteland base complete. All it needs now is a model to sit on top of it. Thank you very much to all my patrons for supporting the creation of these videos, and welcome to newest patron, Udon. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.